What's up, guys? It's Dave and Kyle back here with another brief episode of the podcast. And we wanted to cover something because we got a lot of pushback in the wake of our episode calling for, or rather our short, calling for the prosecution of Taylor Marshall pursuant to canon law for his inciting hatred and animosity towards the Pope, the Holy See, and certain members of the magisterium. And I think a lot of the pushback obviously was absurd. It was reactionary. It was knee-jerk. It wasn't terribly eloquent or articulate. But some of the comments actually, I think, deserve a response because some of them were cogent, and I think they were made in good faith. And there was one in particular that I was thinking about typing out a response, but instead it just made more sense to shoot a very brief episode kind of dealing with some of these good faith, intelligent points that members of our audience are bringing up. And, we're not demagogues, Kyle and I. We're Catholics like you. We're trying to be Orthodox, just complete, unabashed sons of the church, where we're faithful to the church, not some rigid ideology, right or left, but just absolutely like a son of the church, straight down Orthodox in every single way. So we invite people when they think that we're wrong to engage with us, to call us out. I can't say I'm going to call out other podcasters, other Catholic pundits for their errors and think myself absolutely immune from, every error. Now, obviously, I believe everything I say. Kyle believes everything he says. We are, to be sure, not grifters. If I could say something that were untrue, even if it were a little bit untrue, and that thing would make me untold amounts of money, I wouldn't do it out of sheer principle. I forsake the world. I've been poor before, and I can be poor again. I don't care. So we are decidedly not grifters here. And, money and incentive, like popularity, that doesn't do anything really for us. So I just want to tell the truth. So I invite people to call me out when I'm in error. And I would hope that a lot of other podcasters would do the same, although that's not their MO. They like to sit on their soapbox, on their high horse, and pontificate to people as if they're masters of theology, and not just masters of theology like general, I have a theology PhD sort of thing, but they're masters of every subdiscipline of theology too. They all fancy themselves, the philosophy degree lot. These guys that don't even have, theology degrees, they all fancy themselves like masters of sacramental theology, liturgical theology, dogmatics. That's how bad the hubris is. And they think they can read like a 15-minute, news article on something and then look something up in the Summa and then have something intelligent to say about it to their rather large audiences. That's not what we do here. We want to engage with you guys. We take you seriously. We see you as fellow travelers and obviously fellow sons of God. Through baptism into Jesus Christ. So I want to engage with some of this. And the comment that struck my eye, Kyle, was this. I'm going to read it. It came in about, as of the time of the posting of this, it'll be a couple days back, but it's this. If Pope Francis was promulgating the true traditional faith instead of environmental and globalist politics, then Taylor Marshall would not be doing what he is doing. See, this is what really sticks in my craw right here. There's all this talk from the mods in the church about compassion and sympathy and charity for abortionists and for homosexual rights activists and for communists and for everyone else. But when it comes to traditionalists, people who just want to practice and promote the ancient faith of their ancestors, suddenly there's no sympathy to be found at all. Taylor Marshall and Chad Ripperger get all this flack for being rigid and divisive, and Frank Pavone is laicized, yet James Martin is allowed to roam the streets free in his white collar. Double standards, hypocrisy. When that hypocrisy stops, maybe a conversation can be held about Marshall and others, but not before. Last point, Since when did papal infallibility mean that the Pope is the dictator of Catholicism and can do whatever he wants without criticism? I'm not familiar with that ever being the doctrine of the Catholic Church. Yet why has everyone been treating Francis in this manner as if that were the case? If the Pope is espousing heresies and creating confusion, he should be criticized and openly. And if he fails to correct himself, then perhaps measures should be taken to remove him from office and replace him with an Orthodox cleric. Okay. So, Kyle, I'm going to punt to you for just a second. Do you have any thoughts you want to get out there? Just something to put on the record real fast, very quick response to that?
Sure, I would just echo the fact of how you just, opened this video of how you and I are both loyal sons of the church. And I would add to that, we're going to follow truth wherever it leads us. And sometimes it leads us in directions that we didn't expect. This is not like a Pope Francis, God of surprises type of thing here. But, we've been surprised by some things that we found out, that we may have previously held that, just weren't factually accurate in terms of our investigation. We talk about the Pachamama scandal at the Vatican, how it, very is likely. I'm really not convinced that's Pachamama. And, we're going to get called Pope splainers for that. We're going to get called, idolatry pushers or whatever for denying that was Pachamama, because apparently that's like right-wing Catholic dogma now, is that you have to believe that thing at the Vatican was Pachamama. I'm actually not convinced that. If you can convince me of that, fine. I'll be willing to accept that and accept, that there was idolatry at the Vatican. But I don't think that's actually a defensible position at this point anymore. So it's things like that. That's just one example of following truth to wherever it leads. And if it leads against the predilections and the whatever it is on the Catholic right or on the reactionary right, whatever you want to call it, if it leads to something against whatever they're spouting, then I'm going to be against that. It doesn't make me a leftist. That doesn't make me, on the side of James Martin. I can still be critical of both sides of those extremes. So yeah, that's where I'm at with that. And I think, Dave would be right there with me.
Right. I think one of the things we're going to return to on this show a lot is be orthodox, not trad. Be orthodox, not trad. And Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was still Cardinal Ratzinger, and he's talking in the Ratzinger report, warns of serious dangers in the church from the right and the left. Now, obviously, politically, I'm pretty far right, if you guys know my political opinions. But these things, the truth of Christ really transcends these narrow political categories where America and the West have been bifurcated on certain political lines. The truth of Christ transcends that, and we tend to see everything through political glasses when things are just related strictly to the gospel. You can't just take the gospel and be like, well, Christ said, to take care of the poor, and that kind of sounds socialistic, so I don't know if that... You don't judge the gospel and the teaching of the church based on really narrow, temporal, timely, and, changing, capricious political whims and political characterizations. It's the other way around. You judge politics based on the gospel of Christ. You don't judge the gospel of Christ based on politics. So obviously, for the most part, the right wing gets much more correct than the left, and the errors of the left are far more pernicious than those of the right. Nevertheless, there is no infallibility that's claimed by the Republican Party in the United States of America or the conservative parties in Europe. They err all the time. They err significantly. I'm beholden to the truth of Christ. So things don't always just break down in this politically partisan way. I'm a son of the church, and I go where the truth leads, and the church is the arbiter of truth. So that said, let me break down this comment. And Kyle, feel free to jump in. Feel free to interrupt me if you think there's something that needs to be said at any time. But let's go just line by line here. If Pope Francis were promulgating the true traditional faith instead of environmental and globalist politics, then there Taylor Marshall would not be doing what he is doing. Well, I disagree. And the thing is this, because this goes beyond just the Francis pontificate. These trad pundits are often openly critical of John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul II. You know, he's raised their ire on many occasions, and they oftentimes, and I'm not attributing anything particularly here to Taylor Marshall. I would have to support this, and you can go look at his past episodes where I think he's been uncharitable with Paul VI, John Paul II. But, you know, I'm not looking at concrete details here. It's not that kind of video. This transcends Pope Francis, though. That's my point. And I think everybody out there who's an honest observer is going to have to say that, yes, his business model is very much based on critiquing the church through the lens of so-called authentic Catholicism according to the magisterium of Taylor Marshall, meaning he adjudges what is or is not faithful according to his particular personal reading of, like, you know, a 16th century document or something that he's taking wildly out of context. So I disagree. If you can find a lot to dissent from the past, like, 5 popes, you're going to find something to stir up dust over for the next pontificate and the one after that. You don't abandon a working business model. That's not how it goes, you guys. I can't believe that. If you do believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. You know, if you do believe that, like, did you know that gullible is actually not in the dictionary? You gotta think more critically than that. The fact is that he earns a living criticizing the magisterium. So I don't think that's right. And let history judge me by history. You know, we'll see in the next pontificate who's right or wrong. But I want you guys to come back to the comments section and be like, oops, mea culpa. Just like me and Kyle have had to do with the Pachamama thing, you know, which I publicly recanted my very loud, outspoken stance saying that was idolatry. I wrote an article on it that I've had to recant since, because I really don't think that was an act of idolatry. Certainly not by Pope Francis. So, and I'll own it if I'm wrong. If he's, like, you know, super deferent to the next pope, then I'll certainly acknowledge that and own it. Kyle, do you have anything on that score?
So what the commenter is doing here is he's making an excuse. He's giving a rationalization for Marshall's actions. He's saying, look, things are so bad, so Marshall can basically say whatever he wants. And he can basically say false stuff, which he does, which we've pointed out on our show, and which other people have done laudable jobs of pointing out errors in Marshall's public statements. So for a commenter to come along and say, oh, well, he can do that. He can say whatever he wants because things are so bad in the world and in the church. And that's irresponsible. You shouldn't be able to do that. He needs to. Marshall can react. It's fine. We're reacting to Marshall. Marshall's reacting to the state of the church. There's no problem in simply reacting. There's a problem in, I guess, what they call being reactionary. I don't know if I really like that term. It's sort of an overreaction, and a reaction which leads you to start promulgating false things, like Marshall is doing with all the basically sedevacantist talking points that he's putting forth on his channel. That's what he's doing. I mean, it's interesting to anyone who's studied arguments against sedevacantism, and ironically enough, Marshall in his book Infiltration has this whole section about being anti-sedevacantist, but now he's putting forth their same arguments. If you go and look these things up, the things he's saying, and you try to refute them, you stumble upon anti-sedevacantists. So he must be reading someone or some kind of sedevacantist out there who are doing these things. And again, it's irresponsible. He shouldn't be doing it, and it's no excuse to say, "Oh, things are bad, so he's allowed to do it."
Yeah. Well, even look at the language here. He is putting down the true traditional faith, and he's talking about environmental and globalist politics. Those words are, in fact, borrowed from the American right. Those terms are borrowed from the American right. We do have a moral duty to have stewardship over the earth, and to take care of the creation that God gave not to just this generation of men, but to all generations of men until the second coming. So while it's true that we are to have dominion over the earth, and it's for us, it's for our subsistence, it's to sustain us, and that we have this certain command over it, and we're not supposed to subjugate man to creation. Rather, man is supposed to subjugate creation to himself. But it's to be used, for the common good of the human race. So the fact is, when you start saying like, well, if, the Pope does talk about it's sinful to be dumping arsenic into, say, the Amazon River, like, and you're calling that environmentalist, that's idiotic. That's just correct. It's sinful if I were to take like mercury and just dump it into a pristine creek without overriding justification. And, this is where the American right is stupid. The American Republican Party just gets this stuff wrong. You can't have libertarian politics and companies like self-governing. They won't self-govern. They have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders, and ultimately they're going to cut corners and do what they need to do to make a profit, which usually includes some kind of environmental abuse. You actually do need the government. As much as I hate government regulations, and I'm against most government regulations, you do need government regulation in terms of the environment. Of course, they have to be smart policies. It's stupid that we should all drive electric cars and not have gas ovens and all that. But, when Pope Francis talks about good stewardship, now we hear, the reactionaries start to say, well, that's environmentalism. Well, no, it's not. And you have to read him in context and give him the benefit of the doubt. Same with globalism, the church is a universal kingdom. The church is something that transcends national barriers. And when the church has called for, like things in Gaudium et Spes, for programs that also would transcend national barriers for the good of the human race, that doesn't necessarily mean they want some one world Marxist government. Obviously they don't, because the church is also taught that things like Marxism and socialism are inherently evil. So that's not what it could be meaning. You got to take off that silly lens. You have to stop looking at things through the lens of the American right. And the fact is that the only reason you're saying this and making this comment that this is globalism and environmentalism is because you've been groomed by a bunch of capitalistic vultures like Taylor Marshall to think that when the Pope talks about stewardship and he talks about the common good of the human race, that he's actually advocating for environmentalism qua environmentalism and globalism qua globalism, because people have spoon-fed you that narrative because it gets them big clicks and it makes them big money. So you wouldn't even be saying this if you hadn't bought in to the mantra of people who are peddling things that are not good for the church. Cynical conmen, cynical shysters that are peddling a false narrative at the expense of the church. Okay, so moving on. So this is what really sticks in my craw right here. And I think this is the best point. This is a good point. And this is part of the reason I chose. This is a cogent, intelligent thing to say. And I find myself in agreement. And I do wonder, it makes me question the good faith of some of the actions taken against the more loudmouth, heterodox conservatives in the church, because there does seem to be a bit of a double standard. Although, Kyle and I were totally consistent, because I say, get rid of the loudmouths on the right who are heterodox, and get rid of the loudmouths on the left who are heterodox. Yes, get rid of Father James Martin. Laicize him. Do whatever you need to do to silence him from preaching heresy and leading people into the hell of an LGBT lifestyle, right? So we're totally consistent. That's the thing, Kyle. Like, what we say, we can stick to our guns. You can't indict me with my own words, because I'm like, yeah, to hell with all of them, I think Taylor Marshall should be canonically prosecuted. I also think James Martin should be canonically prosecuted. If you can't just say, I'm 100% loyal to the church, I'm 100% a son of the church, yeah, then you are in a bad place. And I think you should be dealt with accordingly. So this is what sticks in my craw right here. There's all this talk from the mods in the church about compassion and sympathy and charity for abortionists and for homosexual rights activists and for communists and for everyone else. But when it comes to traditionalists, suddenly there's no sympathy to be found at all. But there's a couple things here. And he mentions Taylor Marshall and Chad Ripperger as examples of people who are on the right. But the elephant in the room is, of course, that those people have not been prosecuted canonically. I don't think, I'm agnostic on Ripperger. I didn't know he'd ever said anything that was outside the bounds of the church. For certain, I've never known that of him. I don't know of anything particular that he says that undercuts the doctrine of the faith or incites hatred against the magisterium or the Holy Father. So I'll just kind of leave that aside for now, with that caveat. But those people have not been prosecuted. They're still doing fine in the church. There is no interdict against them. They are not canonical criminals. They have not been formally adjudicated as such. So I don't really understand what your point is with bringing up those people. But speaking abstractly, I do sense that, yes, people on the right, people who err on the right are dealt with more harshly than those who err on the left. And I do think that shows some kind of bad will or maybe a greater hostility towards right-wing ideology than hostility towards left-wing ideology. So it's kind of a tipping of the hand, and I do find that quite curious. And should any member of the magisterium or, ranking member of the Holy See stumble across this video, should hell ever freeze over, that is a question I have as a son to a father. Filially, why does there seem to be a greater harshness and tendency to go after people who err on the right than those who err on the left, when the errors on the left, I would say, are far more dangerous to people's actual eternal salvation and bring them more quickly into perdition than the errors on the right? Wanting to uphold a traditional understanding of the death penalty is not something that is spiritually dangerous to somebody in the same way as wanting to normalize homosexuality or dissenting from the church's teaching on birth control and marital conjugality and all of that. So why go after the people who are saying the lesser error when you could, go after the people saying the greater error and then work your way down? Start with the James Martins and then get to, I guess the Taylor Marshalls, although Marshall's rhetoric is getting less and less defensible by the day. It's getting more and more just to be outright treason. Seemingly that's the trajectory by the day. So, yeah, I think that there is something to be said there. I think that's an intelligent critique that deserves airtime. And I thank you for thinking critically. Thank you for noticing that and for bringing that up. Yes, that's something that you should get a pat on the back for being able to see and think with your own mind. And that's a good criticism of when you see somebody going after a right-wing pundit. Now, I don't think it's a winning criticism because, again, we say, yeah, go after them all and go after them in order from greatest to least. So, yeah, cut off the heads of those, metaphorically, of course, cut off the heads of those who are the greatest threat to order, and then work your way down to the more run-of-the-mill revolutionaries and dissenters. Kyle?
Yeah. It's, I guess, a distinction between how to spot these people on both sides of the aisle. The dissenters on the left are sneaky because a lot of them, I think, know that they're trying to subvert church doctrine, and they do it in a very slippery way. They cloak it in ambiguity and deflecting questions and that sort of those sort of types of maneuvers. I think of someone like James Martin, who our commenter mentioned. It's very hard for him to get him to actually admit that he does dissent. He will do a lot of deflection. There are, however, really stark examples of him contradicting church teaching in a heterodox way. So you can find those out there, but he's very crafty in the way that he does it. So, so he can appear to be beyond reproach. The problem with people on the right is a little bit different. There's just a lot of untrained people out there who we've mentioned, and they legitimately think they're doing the right thing. They think they understand that papal document from the 16th century. They think they understand how the magisterium works and how the different levels of certitude in terms of what we're ought to give our assent to in terms of magisterial teaching. They think they know how that works. They think they know how a synod works, which they don't. I just heard a Catholic podcast today getting it wrong about the synod. A person calls into that show or types their comment into that show and asks the presenters, hey, what are we going to do when the Synod on Synodality declares that we're going to have married priests or female deacons? They don't understand how that works. That's not how a synod works. A synod is an advisory body. They don't make declarations in terms of magisterial declarations. They can't do that. If the Pope decides to ratify their decisions, which very seldom happens, whole cloth, it just doesn't do that. The Pope usually takes what they say and edits it and maybe rejects some of it or all of it or none of it. We don't know what's going to happen. But that's just one example, again, of people don't understand how the church actually works because they're not trained in ecclesiology. And it's so that's how you spot those people. Those people just don't understand. They think they're doing the right thing. Like Marshall. Marshall thinks he's a crusader for the church and for tradition and for orthodoxy. That's a great intention, but the means he's taking to get there, the way he's spreading falsehoods is obviously an illicit mean.
Yeah, no, I think generally what you're saying is absolutely right. When people from the left undercut church doctrine, they're doing it from a place of hatred for that doctrine and for the church. When people on the right undercut church doctrine, for the most part, I'm not talking about the extreme nuts, but for the most part, they're doing it out of a love for the church doctrine and the fact that they see encroaching liberalism, like changing church doctrine, which they love. So yeah, left-wing revolt is inherently, seemingly, much more wicked than this kind of right-wing revolt. But they're both revolt. Let's get that straight. They're both types of revolt. One is much nearer and dearer to our heart because obviously Kyle and I love tradition as well, and we want to be upholders of tradition and orthodoxy. The thing is, there's nothing traditional about quibbling with the magisterial actions of the Pope. Nothing traditional about that. There's nothing traditional about dissent. Remember that. What's truly traditional in Catholicism is Rome has spoken. The case is now settled. I assent, Your Holiness. That's traditional Catholicism. That doesn't mean turn your mind off. Obviously, Donum Veritatis and other documents talk about when we can, have uneasy conscience and have a hard time accepting certain magisterial statements, which can be wrong if they're from the ordinary magisterium, rarely, not habitually, but rarely, and that we can, offer good faith corrections and whatnot. There's ways to do that. There's ways to not be in dissent even when you have an issue with a particular teaching. But again, it should be really rare where that happens because the church is guided by the Holy Spirit and has certain charisms and graces of state that you and I simply do not have. So if you find yourself, consistently against the church, you're in a bad place. The problem is you, not the church, I assure you. Okay. Last point. Since when did papal infallibility mean that the Pope is the dictator of Catholicism and can do whatever he wants without criticism? Well, to the first point, I guess forever, since Christ said, "You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church." And I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and what you bind will be bound, and what you loose will be loosed. And then along comes something called Vatican I, where it affirms the power of the Roman pontiff over the Holy Catholic Church, the supreme universal power of the Roman pontiff over the church. So Vatican I and Jesus, that's the first part of the question. So yeah, the Pope is a dictator of Catholicism. I mean, a dictator is an autocrat, right? A dictator is a pejorative for a king. So yes, the Pope is like the king of the church. You can say that. He's the prime minister of Christ's kingdom, who rules in Christ's, while Christ is in heaven seated at the right hand of the Father. The Pope governs the church on earth and stands in for Christ. There's no coincidence there that Christ is the rock and Peter is also called Rock, although Little Rock, and Christ is the main rock, the cornerstone. So that's not a coincidence. So the Pope is the dictator of Catholicism. You're just using a pejorative word. I would say he's the prime minister, the king, the head, something that has less of a bad connotation. The Pope can do whatever he wants without criticism. I am not familiar with that ever being the doctrine of the Catholic Church. Yet why has everyone been treating Francis in this manner as if that were the case? Well, I'm going to read to you from Lumen Gentium, section 25. So that way your problem is not with me, or it's not with, me. It's with the church. The religious submission of mind and will must be shown in a special way to the authentic magisterium of the Roman pontiff, even when he is not speaking ex cathedra. That is, it must be shown in such a way that his supreme magisterium is acknowledged with reverence. The judgments made by him are sincerely adhered to according to his manifest mind and will. His mind and will in the matter may be known either from the character of the documents, from his frequent repetition of the same doctrine, or from his manner of speaking. So, an ecumenical council has said this. An ecumenical council. The extraordinary magisterium of the church has said this. You have to accept what the Pope says with reverence. And even when you correct a Pope, and sometimes there are cases where you do correct a Pope, but you do it like Catherine of Siena. You don't do it like Taylor Marshall. But you can, again, popes rarely will get things wrong. They cannot habitually get things wrong without running afoul of Christ's promise and Christ's gift of the charism and grace of state to Peter and his successors, where Christ says, "Feed my sheep, and I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail, because Satan wants to sift you as wheat." You can't just be habitually doubting the words of the Pope because of those promises of God himself and the prayers of Christ himself. So, and you need to treat what the Pope is saying with reverence. And habitually, we just have people snarking at and mocking and being sardonic about the words of the Holy Father habitually now. You just see it. Whenever you hear a papal interview, then the next week, you bet the grifting podcaster class is going to come out and just be taking shots and low blows at the Holy Father, the Supreme Pontiff. And that's not the way to do it. So that runs afoul of Lumen Gentium 25 and a bunch of stuff before that. It runs afoul of Summa Theologica. Kyle, you.
Yeah, and then, you're going to have the grifting class of podcasters that come out and Pope bash, and then you're going to have us, the so-called Pope splainers, that come out and critique those people because they're actually wrong. And we might even have some legitimate filial criticisms of what the Pope said or alluded to or was ambiguous about. You can do that in a filial way. You just have to be extremely careful to give, sort of both sides of the story, to read it in the best light, to give him the benefit of the doubt, to say, hey, I don't really understand what he's saying here on this airplane interview or Angelus address or whatever it is. But you have to be extremely careful not to be, overly bombastic there, overly critical as to where you can cause scandal for people, because I think that's what a lot of these podcasters are doing. And then there's this, this adoring ignorant public out there that says, well, look, it seems like they're just they're criticizing the Pope, and that the Pope is saying all this stuff. It's hard to not cause scandal when you're a public figure like that, if you're not really careful. And that's really, I mean, what I think that a lot of these people don't keep in mind when they're doing their podcasts.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So here's Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica, second part of the second part, question 33, article 4. He's actually talking about whether you can correct a prelate, an errant prelate, an errant father in the faith. And he says, yes, you absolutely can. He divides correction up into a correction of charity versus a correction of justice. And he says that anyone can correct anyone else through a correction of charity, like a simple warning. And you're doing so not from a place of authority, but just of a place of submission to the law of truth and the law of God, as not through coercion or authority, which is a correction of justice. And such a correction of justice belongs only to prelates, whose business it is not only to admonish, but to correct by means of punishments. He actually says, I answer that a subject is not competent to administer to his prelate the correction, which is an act of justice through the coercive nature of punishment, but the fraternal correction, which is an act of charity, is within the competency of everyone in respect of any person towards whom he is bound by charity, provided there be something in that person which requires correction. Which, by the way, a lot of times these guys are correcting the Pope when he doesn't need correction, because they're the ones who are wrong. Because, believe it or not, the guys with the philosophy PhDs who have never taken a theology course in their life, or at least a Catholic theology course in their life, or the psychology degrees, God forbid, like John Henry Weston, who has psychology degrees, not theology degrees, and Taylor Marshall, who has a philosophy PhD and no Catholic theology degree at all, or, Peter Kwasniewski, who has philosophy PhD and no Catholic theology training, yada, yada, yada. They're getting stuff wrong, and they're correcting the Pope where he hasn't even erred a lot of the time. And they're misleading people to have hatred for the Pope on things where the Pope is right. But Aquinas goes on. He says, now an act which proceeds from a habit or power extends to whatever is contained under the object of that power or habit. Thus, vision extends to all things comprised in the object of sight. Since, however, a virtuous act needs to be moderated by due circumstances, it follows that when a subject corrects his prelate, he ought to do so in a becoming manner, not with impudence or harshness, but with gentleness and respect. Okay, so you guys who are like, well, we can correct the Pope. Sure, but that's going to be rare, because the Pope is going to err a hell of a lot less than we do, because he has a charism. But when he does err, and you are, like Thomas says, sure that there is something that actually requires correction, you have to do it with not impudence and harshness. Like, Taylor Marshall saying that the Pope is preaching heresy from the bowels of hell, when the Pope just says that people who are apostatized from the faith are still members of the communion of saints, which is not something that has been defined dogmatically. It's not something the church has held needs to be believed with divine and Catholic faith. Rather, its theological note is sententia certa. It's something that, we ought to believe that apostates are not part of the communion of saints. But then, the Pope says this, and it does look like the Holy Father was wrong in that case. He's speaking off the cuff. And then you have Taylor Marshall calling him a heretic, despite the fact that the grounds for heresy aren't just you say something that is actually incorrect theologically. The grounds for heresy is that you are a baptized member of the church and you speak something that is denying a truth, and the denial is obstinate, meaning you persist in your error after correction, like the CDF corrects you, and you refuse to back down. So you persist. And the denial of truth is in regard to a doctrine that is to be believed with divine and Catholic faith, not just sententia certa, not just theologically certain, but it must be believed with divine and Catholic faith. Then you have guys like Marshall rushing the microphones to say the Pope is in fact a heretic. No, Taylor Marshall, you're wrong. And you've just calumniated the Holy Father. You've just slandered him for something he was saying off the cuff. He's not been corrected by the CDF for it. And he's a sitting pope, which means no one really judges him anyway in any authoritative fashion. All of canon law is kind of predicated upon that supposition. But so these guys aren't even getting their facts right when they're going and decrying the Pope, when they're going and running down the Pope, and they're taking to their YouTube accounts to say bad things about him. But let alone, they say it in the worst way. They say it with impudence. It's not a filial, reverent critique like Lumen Gentium 25 calls for. It's a wicked, forked tongue, harsh tongue, acerbic critique that's meant to generate clicks. And so, yeah, they're not doing it the right way, you guys. They're not criticizing the Pope in this filial, reverent way, which is the duty that's demanded of us.
Yeah, it's an important distinction to draw out there. The differences in the types of criticism that one is allowed to offer, especially being a layman. And people don't understand those distinctions. It's almost as if the commenter is saying here, he's making this false dichotomy. He's glossing over a lot of stuff here. He's saying that, okay, on one hand, you can either be with Marshall and criticize the Pope, or on the other hand, you're in the group that thinks that everything that comes out of the Pope's mouth is ex cathedra and is, he has a golden tongue or something like that. And that's a false dichotomy. There's so many nuances there that people miss. No, you can be against what Marshall is saying and critique Marshall, and also at the same time, filially, in certain cases, when you have all your facts straight, filially correct the Pope and try to, draw out, the truth of a certain situation, and do it in a proper and respectful way where you're not causing scandal or misleading others into thinking that the Pope is a heretic or something like that. But that's not what's happening here. It's black and white for these people. Either they think they've created these two worlds as to where you're totally just on board with everything the Pope says, or you can't criticize him at all. And that's it's just not how it is.
Right. I mean, that's all I've got. That is everything. It's good we got this out here. We've of course gone over the time we've allotted for this brief episode because
we tell people, and I'm gonna put this out there to our listeners. Every time we do a show, we say that, hey, we're gonna make this show 5 minutes long, and now 43 minutes in, it's okay. I mean, it's good stuff.
Well, we're passionate about it, but I am actually genuinely sorry to you, Kyle, because you were like, I don't know if we have time now. I was like, dude, it's going to be 5 minutes, I promise. And then like 43 minutes. I am retarded. I admit that. I just am going on record saying it for everybody. I am a moron, Kyle. Don't ever listen to me again. That was your fault for listening to me.
I'm gonna clip that. I'll make a good YouTube short out of that. But I'm actually gonna add insult to injury here. I'm gonna rub salt in my own wounds because I got a couple more things to say about this one. Okay.
Oh dang. My boy's riled up.
Two things here. What does he say here? The commenter says, when that hypocrisy stops, maybe a conversation can be held about Marshall and others, but not before. Again, why this order of operations here? Why do we have to eliminate everyone on the left first? Why do we have to punish them first before we can even have a conversation critiquing Marshall? Why can't we do both at the same time? I don't know. Is Taylor Marshall off limits until James Martin is taken care of? So Taylor Marshall can do and say whatever he wants, and I can't say anything about him until we get all the leftists out of the church or punished?
Yeah, I advocated for a descending order of importance based on like the danger level to the church. But yeah, as far as like criticizing them, they're all fair game. And we're all saying, like I say, it's both and. Just go after everybody. It could be one fell swoop. If you're causing scandal in the church, like to hell with you. Be dealt with. And we can say that. And we're like the only guys, like us and Lofton, we're the only guys who can just be like, we're totally consistent. I can punch to the left and I can punch to the right, and I can do it with a straight face and sleep the deep sleep of the just that night because I don't have any compunction about it. I just, again, be orthodox, you guys. Be orthodox, not ideological, you know? Yeah. But I mean, I guess I see a little bit like, if you have limited resources, they call it like prosecutorial discretion in law. If you only have limited resources, it makes sense to lop the head off the most dangerous people. But we don't. Yeah, it's just we can take them all out in one fell swoop. It's not something that's resource intensive. And beyond that, to add to what you're saying, like Marshall's pretty dangerous now. He's leading a lot of people to sedevacantism, to be honest, to an SSPX.
At least to the SSPX.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that out there.
No, that's for sure. I totally agree. And then the last thing I got, it's like, stop throwing Frank Pavone in here with all these guys. Like Frank Pavone is some type of martyr. He's been legitimately disciplined by the church for legitimate offenses. I mean, we've talked.
He's hitting on chicks.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
We have like the credible, whatever it was, sexual harassment allegations. On top of that, years and years of disobedience to at least one bishop, maybe various bishops. And then the Vatican finally says, okay, it's been so long, you're done. Like that's what happened. Stop like using Frank Pavone as some sort of example of a martyr. It does not work.
Yeah, dude, it goes back to what, we kind of opened the show with, where it's things that are theological are now being seen through the lens of American politics. I get it. Whereas anti-abortion as people come, I'm against it. I just did a debate/discussion about why we need to prosecute women who have abortions. Check it out. Like, Kyle and I are really against abortion. Father Pavone, yeah, he did some good pro-life work.
Yeah,
That doesn't mean he can be disobedient and hit on chicks. You have to think deeper than this, you guys. You have to think critically. Just because I do something good in my life doesn't absolve me of a bunch of bad stuff I do. If I go and I make a really good episode that brings people to the church of some show, that doesn't mean I can go home and beat my wife and kick my dog.
Exactly.
Sorry, Kyle.
No, I was a big, Pavone fan back in the day, whatever, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I was first coming back to the church, and Pavone was all over the place, all over the Catholic speaking circuits, all over Catholic radio. And I'm like, yeah, this is a great guy. So of course, when, I first hear about all these things, okay, the Vatican's coming after Frank Pavone, just like the Vatican comes after all the good conservative Catholics out there, allegedly. I raised an eyebrow. I'm like, okay, what is this? And the narrative was they're coming after him because he's pro-life. Really? Pope Francis, the Vatican, the Catholic Church is coming after a priest because he's pro-life? And that's where everyone stopped. Well, that's where all the rad trads stopped. They didn't.
Isn't that what LifeSite was saying? Like, that's literally what the narrative they were spinning was. Oh, the Vatican's going after this pro-life priest. Even though Pope Francis has been out there saying abortion is like throwing a baby in the trash and that women are hiring an assassin to kill their babies. The Vatican's pretty, even lefty priests, by the way, are pretty pro-life. If you read like lefty priests' Twitter, they're against abortion, by the way, you guys. James Martin is against abortion. It doesn't absolve you of all the other crimes that you commit. I don't think people know that.
No, no, they don't, and they go with whatever their favorite pundit is saying, apparently, and they don't read further on in the story. They don't read the subsequent paragraphs, because if you did that in the Pavone situation, unfortunately, we find out that it seems like this guy is not who he claimed to be, or that he had some flaws, obviously, and maybe he was, I don't doubt that he was sincerely pro-life and, a crusader and all that and doing good work. I don't have any reason to doubt that. But he had, some other stuff going on the side that was extremely problematic that, the Vatican finally stepped in, and rightly so.
Dude, you cannot read church news through an American political lens, because all the simpletons, the simpleton editors here, all they understand is like big government bad, small government good. So anytime something happens to somebody who's supposedly in our circle, one of our guys, then it becomes us versus them, and the them automatically becomes the bad guy. So if a pro-life priest is now disciplined, then, whoever's disciplining him, obviously we need to go after them. We need to attack them. You can't think like that, and you can't fall for clickbait headlines. LifeSite News is not going to produce responsible headlines, because that won't generate them the revenue that they really want. So they have to use clickbait. And if you just read their lead, the lead sentence, the opening paragraph, the clickbait headline, you're going to come away with a false sense of what the news actually is. You have to think critically, which is why we don't want automatons in our audience. We want people who have the ability to criticize, Kyle and me, who aren't just shills for the latest propaganda coming out of the Taylor Marshall program, but who are critical thinkers, who are doing their best as seekers of truth to uphold the orthodoxy of the church. That's what we actually want. So yeah, criticize us in the comment box. Yeah. But if you're wrong, we're going to own you. We're going to dunk on you. But at the same time, we admire people who do demonstrate, critical thinking ability. Just remember, be trad, or be trad. Don't buy just trad party lines. Be orthodox, not trad.
Yeah, and be like that commenter who we cited. I mean, we did a whole show going through various comments from the audience. This is only one comment that we've spent almost an hour on. But it was good. No, like Dave said, we appreciate this comment because there were things in there that we agree with, things in there that we disagree with, and we want those types of people in our audience because hopefully we can guide you in the right direction where we see that you are wrong, and we're going to call you out in a, like we're talking about correcting the Pope in a filial way. We're going to correct you in a filial way. And maybe you can correct us on some stuff. I don't know. Maybe we're wrong about some factual stuff. Who knows? Put your comments in there. We do appreciate them. All right, Dave, that's all I got.
Sure. Yeah, good job, Kyle. Thanks for humoring me with this 5-minute episode. I think I owe you a beer.
It is the longest 5-minute episode ever. All right, people. Yeah, I will take you up on that beer, and I'm gonna.
It's like 5 minutes of woman time.
It is.
Like on a woman's internal clock. 5 minutes.
Just gonna take 5 minutes. I got it. A beer sounds good. I think I'm gonna go have one right now. All right, everyone. Do support us on Patreon. The links in the show notes below. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Give a like. You know what to do with all that stuff. God bless you. We'll see you next time.